Hi everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank Professor Patriarca for inviting me to give a lecture in the framework of her course on nationalisms and racisms in modern Europe. It's a great pleasure for me. Unfortunately, we can't meet at Rose Hill as it should have been. These are hard days, and it only remains for me to wish us better times. Today, my job is to present some contents of my current research. I'm so sorry that we have to discuss about it remotely, but please note that you can email me for any doubts, clarification, or questions. Just a few words to introduce myself. Basically, I'm a historian of modern and contemporary Christianity, and I specialized in the relationship between Catholicism, nationalism, and war cultures during the 19th and 20th centuries. As a recipient of a Marie Curie Fellowship, I'm carrying out an international research program funded by the European Commission. My institution of reference is the University of Florence in Italy, and I have been appointed as a visiting scholar at the Fordham History Department. The title of my project is Catholicism and the Negro Question, Religion, Racism and Anti-Racism in a Transnational Perspective, United States and Europe. May I just make one point? It should be clear that I will use the terms race or Negro as cultural and social constructs. It goes without saying that this is not my language or point of view. These words reflect a particular mindset, a system of meanings, which is to be investigated, understood, and deconstructed. In his great work, The Interpretation of Cultures, Clifford Geertz says that man is an animal suspended in webs of significance he himself has spun. Indeed, I would like to trace the specific webs of significance which framed Catholic responses to blackness and white supremacy. Following the classic pattern laid out by George Fredrickson in Racism: A Short History, I'm applying this term to Jim Crow, segregation in the US, South African apartheid, and European post-colonial societies. I'm interested in pointing out such a background of meanings and idioms which structured and influenced ideologies, experiences, and practices of discrimination, sometimes without the protagonists of the time were fully aware of that. I will focus on two issues in particular. The first one is the problem of Catholic anti-black racism. How did Catholics look at black race? What are the Catholic teaching and theological contributions concerning that topic? Had the Catholic Church a role in framing racial discourses and behaviors and fueling black racialization? During the 1930s, Vatican censored racism in its biologist, German and neo-pagan version. Can we infer that a sound racism was still possible? Let me anticipate three hypotheses. 1. Racism was rejected due to its similarity to Nazi ideology and its imitations, that is, fascist racism or South African apartheid. 2. On the basis of that restrictive definition, the word racism was not used to mean segregation based on ethnical cultural premises. 3. Catholic positions did not exclude soft Western-centered racialism, including differentialism, essentialist assertions, and ethnocultural hierarchy. The second issue concerns the rise of Catholic interracialism as a peculiar third way between racism and anti-racism. I shall speak on interracialism as the Catholic way, that is thought as a true anti-racism, and a specific model different from secular and Protestant options. Now, a question arises: did interracialism really change traditional race thinking? Did it radically object to the principle equal but separate? Did it provide a language of reform or rather a tool of conservatism? To what extent did Catholicism oppose racism and mobilize against it? What were the ideological interactions between the American-style interracialism and the European colonial and post-colonial culture? I'm gonna try to make some interpretations by focusing on the period of time between the 1930s and the age of decolonization and the climax of US civil rights movement, that is 1960s. Interracial think tanks can be identified in interracial councils, ecclesiastical universities and colleges, missionary magazines and societies, but also social and cultural events organized by lay organizations such as French Pax Christi's Quinzaine Missionnaire and Ad Lucem Journée Interraciale, or Fordham's Interracial Sundays. We can take the March on Washington of August 1963, in which Lafarge and several interracialist activists were involved, as the culmination of the interracial movement from a number of points of view. Some historians identified in Catholic interracialism another strand of the long civil rights movement dating back long before the desegregation golden era, which was inaugurated by the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, 1954, decision by the US Supreme Court. Ironically, the time when interracialism became mainstream in the Catholic arena also marked the rise of a new progressive model of Catholic anti-racism, more in line with the Vatican II aggiornamento, that is a renewal, and the 1960s modernization. This implied an ecumenical vision, cooperation with non-Catholic activists, and a clear shift of objectives and interests from the issue of natural rights to that of civil and political rights, from so-called Negro apostolate and conversion to the worldly goal of emancipation and social equality. This new paradigm had his own non-Catholic hero and then martyr, Martin Luther King, who was regarded by Paul VI himself as a Christian example preaching racial justice, unlike violent black power. It must be noticed the great delay with which the Catholic teaching officially and solemnly condemned racism. In the age of Vatican Council II, Popes John XXIII and Paul VI condemned racial discrimination on several occasions as contrary to God's intent. The encyclical Pacem in Terris in 1963 called for the elimination of every trace of racism in the framework of post-colonial state relations, and the encyclical Populorum Progressio identified in racism and nationalism the two main obstacles for the development of world solidarity. But it was only much later, in 1988, that the Pontifical Justice and Peace Commission issued a document entirely devoted to the sin of racism, the Church and racism towards a more fraternal society. This document was not free of self-justification and bias, where it is stated that in the 18th century a veritable racist ideology opposed to the teaching of the Church was forged, or that the Church always raised its voice against racial inequality. And in fact, the text recalls that 50 years before, Pope Pius XI prepared a major encyclical on the unity of the human race, which was to condemn racism. but it overlooks the real reasons why it didn't happen. This shows a total lack of self-criticism. In the text, modern secularization is blamed for racism, whose description is shaped on the Nazi model of racism. This is an interpretation reflecting long-lasting patterns, which were even transposed into historiography. We can identify in Interracial Justice, a study of the Catholic doctrine of race relations by John Lafarge, the most influential book in the Catholic scenario dealing with racial integration at the turn of the Second World War, a real turning point which represented a call for action against anti-Black discrimination. Lafarge was an American Jesuit leader of the Catholic interracial movement and chaplain of the Catholic Interracial Council of New York. His work, which was published in 1937 and reappeared in revised editions over the 50s, strongly opposed the myth of race, contesting it as a scientific and juridical datum. It is significant that one of the first references of Lafarge was the anthropologist Franz Boas, who thought that the different traits of any group of people were the product of historical developments, environment and culture, and not of race in a biological sense. In 1938, Pius XI read this book, and in a private audience he commissioned the Jesuit to prepare an encyclical on the race question. Together with two other European Jesuits, the German Gustav Gundlach and the French Gustave de Buquois, Lafarge drew up a draft, which was to be titled Humani Generis Unitas, the unity of human race. It is the previously mentioned hidden or missed encyclical against racism and anti-Semitism, which was never published after Pius XI's death in 1939. A lost opportunity for Catholicism. We can't disregard the transnational influence of the group Lafarge gathered around the Interracial Review, the mouthpiece of the Catholic Interracial Council of New York, which was founded in 1934, and one of the most important journals on race relations. Furthermore, in 1959, the National Catholic Conference for Interracial Justice was established to coordinate the local councils. Interracial movement gained momentum in post-World War II. A fierce interracial literature spread in the US and in Europe after World War II. However, interracialist mobilization remained controversial. I'd like to anticipate some general keys of reading concerning paradoxes and limits of the Catholic interracial ideology and hampering the interracial agenda. Euro-Western centrism, anti-Protestantism, anti-secularism, the rejection of black protest perceived as a danger to the social order. Furthermore, the problem of intermarriage and miscegenation can be taken as a sort of test bench. Catholics generally stressed the moral reasons against such unions because of the differences of culture. The argument was that mixed marriages were often interdenominational and so conflicted with Catholic ethics, or in any case they put together people of inconsistent cultures. That discourse was factually ambivalent in mixing religious concerns and racial worries. Clerical paternalism was another sticking point, Historians have shown that African American Catholics worked in spite of white interracialist Catholics to challenge anti-black racism embedded in the Catholic Church itself. Their leader, Thomas W. Turner, a black lay Catholic who founded the Federated Colored Catholics in 1924, asked for blacks' self-determination in struggling against white supremacy and clashed with the moderate vision of white interracialist Catholics. Even if interracialists did not generally argue that anti-racist activists were in the pay of the Soviet Union, they did fear that black protests and demonstrations could lead to racial riots. Let us think to the Harlem riot of 1935, for example, throwing the country into chaos and, as a result, into the arms of socialism. As you know, the word racism, from the French racisme, gained currency during the 1920s, 1930s. It started to be used to polemically label the folkish ideology leading to National Socialism. Such a neologism did not just indicate racialism, that is, the classification of humankind into distinct entities called races, which are delineated with descent, phenotype, heritable tendencies, and regarded as primordial, static, and homogeneous. Rather, it designated an ideology and a harmful system of belief fed by hatred, trying to establish a political system based on a natural hierarchy of supposedly superior and inferior races. In the interwar period, two discursive fields were created: racism versus anti-racism, and the Roman Catholic Church strongly took part in the conceptualization of this antinomy. I'll try to sketch some remarks adopting a transnational approach, but let me start from a reference to the present time. In November 2018, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops admitted that the problem of anti-black Catholic racism has existed and still exists. In their pastoral letter, Open Wide Our Hearts, the bishops invited the faithful to ask for forgiveness, and I'm quoting, "The truth is that the sons and daughters of the Catholic Church have been complicit in the evil of racism." Not long ago, in many Catholic parishes, people of color were relegated to segregated seating and required to receive the Holy Eucharist after white parishioners. The pastoral letter places itself in the context of the rise in explicit racist behavior since the election of Donald Trump and of the 2017 accidents in Charlottesville. The bishops encouraged white Catholics to reflect on the deep prejudice against African Americans, and it is a fact that the Catholic Church, both in European colonial empires and in America, reinforced for a long time the black and white divide. Writing in 1925 for the magazine Crisis, William Dubois argued that the Catholic Church in America stands for color separation and discrimination to a degree equaled by no other church in America. And during the 19th century and most part of the 20th century, Catholic authorities and communities generally accepted race-based discrimination and color bar as a matter of natural law, or in the most extreme cases, as a condition resulting from divine law. A tragic consequence was silence, or even cooperation in racial violence and injustice. Not only slave-holding was a way of life for Southern American Catholics. John McGreevy's classic book Parish Boundaries, The Catholic Encounter with Race in the 20th Century Urban North, shows how Catholics of European descent whitened in the context of African Americans moving in large numbers to Catholic neighborhoods in the urban North. The parish system of dividing communities according to ethnicity applied to incoming black Catholics and contributed to the practice of racially segregated churches. How was it possible, considering the universalist message of Christianity? It may seem strange, but the problem of Catholic racism and anti-racism is often evoked but much less historicized. Let me be clear. There's a lot of history papers and books about the way the Church confronted racism and racial discrimination. European historiography has addressed this matter mainly from the perspective of Christian anti-Semitism, actually. In contrast, US historiography has devoted greater attention to the relationship between the Catholic Church and the African American condition, supplying evidence of the gap between the rhetoric of Christian brotherliness and the reality of discrimination. Scholars have emphasized the figures involved in the black-white integration and examined some local contexts. Concerning Italy, studies by Professor Patriarca and Lucia Ceci formulated the problem of the conflicting Catholic attitudes on hybrid unions, that is, race mixing, and color line between fascism and the Republic. But an overall investigation of Catholic thought and activism on anti-black racism is still lacking. In this regard, a large part of historiography looks affected by a sort of bias. It tended to consider Catholic anti-black racism as a sort of adaptation or subordination to mainstream culture. I strongly believe that this is a misleading perspective. Some recent works, for example John Connelly's From Enemy to Brother, have stressed the need to analyze the original characters of Catholic racism, and first of all to use the category of Catholic racism, which is still a contested concept, in terms of thought patterns and paradigms. There's a lot to do regarding the specific nature of religious racism from a culturalist approach, that is, images, symbols, and rhetorics. This is also a weakness of the 2018 pastoral letter. I mean, the emphasis on the personal dimension of racism too easily covers over its structural and cultural presence in ecclesiastical experience. Many scholars draw a sharp distinction between religious prejudice and racial biologist racism. This is pretty problematic. According to what we might call the secularization thesis, the rise of political modernity led to the decline of Christian universalism and paved the way for scientific racism, based on explicit biological theories of human difference. The influential work by George Mossey, Toward the Final Solution, A History of European Racism, is representative of that paradigm. Mossey identifies two sources of modern racism. On the one hand, the Enlightenment, on the other hand, Pietism, that is, religious revival, which stressed the needs of inner man and developed outside the outside ecclesiastical institutions, creating a new secular religion of community. The centerpiece of Moses' thesis is that the Enlightenment, which was marked by the rise of scientific thought, defined racism as a set of beliefs focused on biological determinism. This interpretation has some side effects. Strictly speaking, it clears the Catholic Church of racist allegations, arguing that biology is the necessary prerequisite for the existence of racism. Catholicism and religions in general remain outside this domain. Biological determinism is posited as incompatible with religious prejudice, which does not exclude the assimilation of the other, and does not naturalize differences, grounding them to human biology, physical characteristics, or descent. As a result, we should assume at most a betrayal of Christian values, as if racism was not inherent with Catholic worldview, but imported from outside. Nor we can be satisfied with a cultural captivity thesis, arguing that Catholics could not help but go along with the status quo in accordance with the spirit of the time. I believe that such readings are unsatisfying because they fail in describing the so-called religion-race constellation. I refer to the interaction between religious identity and essentialist notions of cultural difference. The emphasis on biologist racism prevents us from understanding what Pierre-André Taguieff calls differentialist racism, whose dominant theme is not biology or heredity, but insurmountable cultural differences. In other words, racism has to do with essentialism, that is, the belief in the existence of fixed and uniform characteristics that differentiate groups of people, whereby the individual is reduced to simple representative of the group he/she belongs, which is meant like a natural and unchangeable reality. This implies hierarchy, stereotypes, and construction of otherness, but racialization and racism can operate through categories not expressly named as race, even if discourses on phenotype never fully disappear. This is something true for the age of retreat of scientific racism, but I think that such a wording can also be useful to understand the specificity of Catholic standpoint of blackness. Again, discrimination, hostility, negative stereotyping can be justified in terms of cultural and not physical inferiority, although it is sometimes performed in a seemingly benevolent way. I'm guessing that the Catholic approach falls under that case. There is a background of mainstream Catholic racism, which was not overtly biological based and was legitimized by the church hierarchy as long as it was free of hatred and exaggerations. To put it simply, the point is that Catholicism itself contributed to the spirit of the time in its own way. And in his book, Christianity in the 20th Century, A World History, Brian Stanley devotes a chapter to Christianity and ethnic hatred. By analyzing the two case studies of Nazi Germany and Rwanda, he notes that the profession of Christian belief, or even the acquisition of a high level of theological scholarship, did not provide an effective firewall against the virus of ethnic hostility. Besides, scholars of early modern history and Fredrickson too argue that unquestionable interplay between religious racism and racialized religion occurred in Western Christendom. Intolerance against minorities such as Jews, Muslims, or dark-skinned people, mixed discrimination on religious ground and concern about the purity of blood. Christian worldview conveyed the idea that inferiority was also bodily, insofar as it was carried in the blood. For example, Jewish converts to Christianity were persecuted because it was thought that the impurity of their blood made them incapable of a true conversion. Or let us think to blacks too and their relationship with slavery. One rationale for holding Africans in servitude, regardless of their religious status, was the popular belief in the curse of Ham or Shem. That is the belief based on a wrong interpretation of the Bible according to which black Africans descended from Noah's banished son Ham. This one drew the wrath of God because he viewed his father in a naked and drunk attitude and mocked him. For this transgression, his son and descendants were condemned to be servants unto servants. The physical result of the curse became a blackening of the skin. Why am I talking about that? Because this is not just the oddity of a distant past. We cannot underestimate the persisting popularity of a religious racism which mentioned the curse of Ham for blacks' minority status during the 19th and 20th century. Both in America and Europe, the myth of Ham is something unusual to our eyes. But why was this a compelling argument at the time and no longer today? One possible answer is that it was inscribed in the ideology of Christian civilization, which characterized intransigent and anti-modern Catholicism in the age of bourgeois revolution. In the age of imperialism and Jim Crow segregation, Catholics largely supported the condemnation of black slavery and anti-black hatred as established by Pope Gregory XVI. But anti-slavery mobilization went hand in hand with the reaffirmation of the white and Catholic man's burden, by accepting the idea that the Negro was naturally childlike and needed to be regenerated from his vices, barbarism, infidelity if not baptized, or heresy if Protestant. Let us mention the entry in Negro race of the Catholic Encyclopedia, which was published in New York in 1911. The Negro has a religious nature. His docile, cheerful, and emotional disposition is much influenced by his immediate environment, whether those surroundings be good or evil. The Negro is naturally gregarious, and the dissipations and conditions of city life in many instances corrupt the native simplicity of the younger generation to the sorrow of their more conservative elders. That's a typical example of an essentialist point of view filled with stereotypes. The article reflects a benevolent and compassionate racism which doesn't express contempt, but it also expresses the idea that black people are inferior, of course, primitive, ignorant, and in short they are backward. Nevertheless, blacks can improve themselves. They can be assimilated to Western Christian culture. That will happen through Christianization. Please note that the Catholic horizon of the so-called Negro apostolate is precisely conversion. This is true both for colonial Africans and African Americans. Such a view implies that blacks are effectively outside the Catholic community, not by nature but for a number of circumstances. Furthermore, the conversion of blacks was meant to mitigate the teaching of contempt associated to the curse of Ham, because though black races had been cursed by God, they could and would be redeemed by Him as well. At the same time, it upheld anti-blackness much more than it undermined it, as it assumed that people of African descent have not yet reached a stage of development which justified their independence. Negro apostolate turned, I'm quoting, desolation, fearness into the most joyful fertility of religion and civilization. These words are taken from the encyclical In Plurimis by Leo XIII. Even if blacks' minority status is not absolutized, colonialism, discrimination and a different treatment for dark-skinned people are justified. The belief in the curse of Ham was so interiorized by large sectors of the Church that at the First Vatican Council in 1869-70, a group of bishops submitted a petition for the evangelization of Africa, which requested that the curse of Ham be lifted from the African peoples. This petition was written by an Italian missionary, Daniele Comboni, and shows that an important part of the Catholic hierarchy believed that the curse of Ham was real and not a slander, legitimizing racial oppression. The petitioners simply begged God to mitigate the consequences of that damnation. Although the council did not have time to discuss that issue, the bishops drew up a prayer which was approved by Pius IX in 1873. This prayer, to implore the conversion of the descendants of Cham in Central Africa, was included in the official collection of prayers, and the text invited the faithful to pray for the most wretched Ethiopians, namely for black Africans, who were still seated in the darkness and the shadow of death, so that God may move the curse of Cham from their heart. Devotional mobilization was intended to expedite Christian civilization of African people. For the churchmen at the time, without Christianity there can be no civilization, as a providential event in view of the return of the whole secularized world under the church direction. The overall sense is an admission that there are peoples or ethnic groups with fewer rights than people supposed to be civilized. In the mentality of European missionaries or American priests devoted exclusively to evangelization of blacks, such as the Josephites, black inferiority was codified in terms of faith and culture, but made provision for the possibility of conversion and hence redemption. Outspoken racism and segregation were actually an obstacle to the so-called Negro apostolate. But religious beliefs such as the curse of Ham are not the only rationale for Catholic anti-black prejudice. There are other reasons concerning natural law and moral theology. Broadly speaking, Catholic thought makes reference to the unity of humankind in Christ and the common human origins in Adam and Eve. But Catholic theology qualifies it as a theology of differences too. Theologians of the early 20th century normally believed that human races were part of the natural order, and races did consist of persons sharing the same physical and spiritual characteristics. And if races belonged to nature, like the nations, and Catholics had precise obligations towards them. One of the most important Catholic experts on race was the Austrian anthropologist Father Wilhelm Schmidt, who was appointed the first director of the Vatican Missionary Ethnological Museum in the 1930s. In his authoritative book Rasse und Volk, he refuted the idea that pure races existed, including the Aryan one. Lafarge cites Schmidt to argue against the inheritance of any fixed or stable mental traits supposed to be applied to different groups of people, which is the basis of any racialist and racist discourse. However, Schmidt shares the mainstream view that a variety of races do exist. The point is that races are dynamic entities, and racial differences are accidental and not substantial. Races can evolve. If a psychic trend exists, bodily aspects are pivotal, but environment is relevant too. In conclusion, even if Schmidt prefers the concept of folk, that is, people, nation, races really exist, according to this book. And despite Schmidt is skeptical about the hereditability of certain characteristics, he writes that 1,000 years of moral distortion and brutalization have a secondary but real effect on physical race. These racial effects are not neutralized by baptism. For that, for example, converted Jews belonged to the church, but not in the same way as their German fellows. We are talking about views that are not only confined to Catholic intellectuals. Vatican statements betray ambivalence too, sharing the attitude that races were as substantial as nations or peoples. In 1934, the Vatican Secretary of State and later Pope Pius XII, Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, wrote the German government a memorandum affirming that the Church recognizes race as a biological fact and doesn't deny the value that reposes in race when understood in certain boundaries apart from all exaggeration. Pacelli refers to the mistake of making race thinking absolute or to make race a substitute for religion. I would like to point out the background of papal teaching. During the 1930s, the Holy See developed a very ambivalent distinction between an exaggerated racism and a sound or moderate racism. Pius XI said that concept, clearly addressing the students of the Collegio de Propaganda Fide on July 28, 1938. The Collegio is the Roman college which was established with the purpose of training missionaries. According to the Pope, the human type, genere in Italian, was one single great universal Catholic human race, one family, great family. Yet in this family, diverse variations exist, which Pius XI called special races. Within the framework of Catholic universalism, there were some things to be well understood, put in their place, and not to be forgotten. That is the idea of race, of stock, or nation. So, the true and just and sound practice of racism, I'm quoting from the speech of the Pope, that responds to human dignity and reality combined universality and particularity in the same way, In the papal teaching, racial differences, as well as class and national differences, are part of the divine plan and natural law. Against individualistic modernity, the Pope suggests that men are organized, should be organized, in groups of people with different features, tasks, duties, and rights, all contributing to common good. The meaning is that the global sense is that even if there are not inferior and superior races by nature, some talented and privileged ones were chosen by Providence to direct the development of civilization. At this regard, the position of La Civiltà Cattolica is enlightening. The Civiltà Cattolica is the magazine of the Italian Jesuits, a sort of semi-official mouthpiece of the Holy See. This journal, this magazine, emphasized that the Church did not support or encourage the separation of races, but considered segregation as a social institution to be tolerated. At the same time, it argued that Catholicism works at changing minds, so that racial divide gradually moderated without turmoil and arrest. Nonetheless, the existence of segregated churches was seen as basically beneficial to blacks because they could receive a proper Christian education which fitted with their immature racial attitude. For example, they can devote to musical activities and concerts. In 1937, another Jesuit, Mario Barbera, reviewed interracial justice by Lafarge. First, he stated that psychic racial inclinations exist, but they are the result of millennial crossbreeding. In short, every stock has its own character, that is a specific way of thinking and acting, a sort of persistent collective mind. Second, there were not absolutely superior races. If anything, there were ethnic groups or peoples, I'm quoting, with morphological, psychological, linguistic, and cultural differences, some of them superior to others temporarily and not permanently. There were no races destined to rule and others destined to serve, but ethnic groups which undertake civilization more or less rapidly and decline or rise. Barbera inferred that there could not be substantial differences between these groups with regard to human rights and duties, but only accidental differences of measures best suited to these than to those. The supposed inferior peoples or groups like the blacks were called to make progress once they joined Christian religion. What emerges is that the major Catholics, opinion makers, condemned racism only in its biologist, neo-pagan, and Nazi-style form, and yet Catholics accepted much of the 20th century racialism and largely legitimized the notion of race. The Holy See, contrary to what is often said, never forbade race thinking, and to some extent and degree racist thinking. This is evident by the drafting process in 1934-36 of a doctrinal condemnation, a sort of syllabus against the three modern heresies of racism, nationalism, and totalitarianism. Finally, the Holy Office decided not to make public that document in order to avoid a diplomatic issue with fascist regimes, but an interesting aspect is that the consultants of the Holy Office agreed that the love for one's race did not oppose to right reason, as long as it led to enhance the good qualities of ancestry and improve the population through positive eugenics versus negative eugenics, that is compulsory sterilization or euthanasia. To sum up, a feeble and ambivalent anti-racist attempt in this case opens the doors to the consideration that a well-understood racism, which does not elevate race above all the rest, including religion, is fully compliant with Catholic teaching. The linguistic device to differentiate Catholic sound racism from wrong biologist racism is the use of the term stock, in Italian stirpe, instead of race, razza. Stirpe, having fewer connotations in scientific and determinist sense, served to evoke a spiritual background. Anyway, stock is used by Pius XI and the Italian Vatican Catholic speakers, but stirpe keeps getting translated as race in English language Catholic documents of the time. Finally, please note the opposition to intermarriage, miscegenation, and racial mixing that coming within a sound Catholic racism. The Church discouraged miscegenation, not because of biological reasons, but because of the different levels of civilization and spiritual development, which are embedded in any racial group. Restriction of interracial marriages should be supported because of the danger of deficient offspring, the incompatibility of character and culture, the need to back the efforts of civil authorities to improve the population from a physical and psychological point of view. Under current conditions, this is the rationale, it was imprudent to mix the races. This was also the perspective of the majority of American Catholics before the Civil Rights era. Such a paradigm was confirmed by other Vatican and papal interventions. For example, the encyclical Mit brennende Sorge about National Socialism. Pius XI says that whoever exalts race or any other fundamental value of the human community, and I'm quoting, however essential and honorable be their place in worldly order, making them the highest norm of all, higher than religious values, and worships them with idolatry, perverts and distorts the order of things provided and commanded by God. This passage is often misinterpreted as a full condemnation of racism, but nevertheless it acknowledges that race is a positive worldly reality, necessary and honorable. The target was the idolatry of race, shaping a secular cult in competition with Christianity. I mean that Mit brennende Sorge was an attack on extreme neo-pagan racist ideology, but it admits that the existence of races and assessments of their value. A similar case is the Instruction on the Errors Concerning the Human Race, which was issued in April 1938 by the Sacred Congregation of Seminaries and Universities. The document condemns the following theories. Point 1. Races are immutable and differ so much that the humblest of them is further from the highest race than of the highest animal species. Point 2, we must by all means preserve and cultivate purity of blood. Point 3, all the intellectual and moral qualities of man derive from blood. Point 4, religion is subject to the law of race. The structure of the document is very vague, to the point that the following assertions remain tolerable. Point 1, a limited and accidental gradation of races exists. Point 2, one can conserve the vigor of the race and the purity of its blood within the limits of moral order. Point 3, racial factors have some influence upon intellectual and moral qualities. Point 4, one should cultivate a balanced love of one's race as one among the many good things of creation. On this basis, the limits and contradictions of Catholic anti-racism become more understandable. In short, a large number of Catholic interracialists who were highly critical of racism shared several cultural patterns of Catholic race thinking, including essentialism and stereotyping. In 1938, for example, the Interracial Review said that the Negro is deeply religious and his religion is a real part of his everyday existence. Catholicism furnishes him a real substitute for the emotionalism which characterizes so much of the Negro's belief in God. In interracial justice, Lafarge argues that there is no Negro race, but a Negro population group. But it seems like he's displacing the problem rather than resolving it. He uses the term racial groups too, but contrary to La Civiltà Cattolica, he says that physical and mental traits are inherited not universally by the group as such, but by the individuals pertaining to the group. He defines the racial group as a large number of people who have a common background of origin, but who share a common social experience too. So we have also a sociological approach. Even so, Lafarge's vision on segregation and intermarriage was very conservative, fostering a gradual approach in the face of black protest and separatism. In his opinion, segregation tends to objective injustice affecting human rights. Anyway, while working for changing that, black people should make use of the opportunities of development granted by the segregated system. That is to say that the chance of Christian apostolate, which is also made possible by Jim Crow regulations introduced into religious practices, comes before the desire to usher in an interracial society organized upon the basis of justice, and etc. Another topical issue is intermarriage. Lafarge insisted that there was no legitimate race-based argument against intermarriage and miscegenation from a purely biological standpoint. The example is of Blessed Martin de Porres, for example, a 16th, 17th century Dominican who was born from mixed Spanish and Negro blood, I'm quoting, was seen as the evidence that miscegenation doesn't mean deterioration. He argued, however, that Lafarge argued that there were two moral arguments against intermarriages. First of all, they are banned by law in several states, and the Church told Catholics to respect the law and obey legitimate authorities. Second, there are serious reasons arising from the great difference of condition which is usually experienced by the members of respective groups. According to Lafarge, interracial marriages, given the social exclusion people would impose on the family, would in most cases be unhappy and spiritually dangerous. So intermarriage would increase tension, not unlike the tension which is produced by mixed marriage in the field of religion. This is a peculiar explanation and very similar to the one put forward by the Holy See on the subject of the fascist Lessona decree of 1937, forbidding race-mixed unions between Italian citizens and native women in Eastern African colonies. Cardinals of the Roman Curia made clear that the Catholic Church never established impediments for marriages involving subjects of different race, but they added that the Church cooperated in safeguarding the health of the race and preventing hybrid unions because of social and cultural motivations. Since the majority of Ethiopians were non-Catholic, interracial unions were not to be recommended, just like interfaith marriages. So, were blacks in majority Protestant or not? At a closer look, also the hidden encyclical is pretty ambiguous. Reading the text, the impression is that what is condemned as absurd is racism as an ideology ignoring the unity of humankind and not racialism. Racial bond, race, the use of the term race, we can read in the text, remains within the limits of verifiable observation. The problem is that racism claims for itself an extensive totality. That is, it places race in such a central position and assigns to it such exclusive significance that obliterates universalism. Harmful racism means a rigid separation of superior and inferior races and unchangeable racial differences, but diversity of races is unquestionable. And I'm quoting, "Certainly, there exist today some more or less perfect or more or less perfectly developed races if we measure them by the outward manifestation of cultural life. But these differences come from and are determined by the environment, in the sense that only through the influences of the environment could original racial tendencies develop in one or the other manner and still continue to develop. Again, no essential differences, but accidental and temporary differences." This passage is a sort of carbon copy of what La Civiltà Cattolica said. As a result, colonization, promoting the principle of Christian morals in order to raise the low cultural level of black racial groups, is seen as a fair issue. Furthermore, people of goodwill should work to eradicate from public life segregation based on race, but such differences, and I'm quoting, "and such social separations as brotherly love and prudence may counsel to the advantage of all different races in view of the actual circumstances, no one will reasonably consider as discriminatory." We can see here the limits of Catholic interracialism and the reasons why Catholic interracialists, while seeking to fight against racism, did not call themselves anti-racist. And the point is that anti-racism sounds a deceptive notion for them because it posits an equalization or obliteration of differences. And as we have seen before, Catholic teaching do provide for a theology of differences and racial differences too. We can summarize this trend by the term racialist differentialism. This is true also for the post-World War II period. 1945 is not a real watershed. A great continuity of arguments can be detected after the collapse of fascist regimes and the retreat of scientific racism. We can only catch a slight but significant change, namely that the distinction between a true and a false, wrong, harmful racism goes missing. In the post-war period, racism without adjectives is refused, but again it is imagined and depicted as a biologist Nazi-style phenomenon. Let us take two examples. The first one is the entries Razza and Razzismo of the Dizionario di Teologia Morale, a work published in 1954 under the sponsorship of the Vatican Sacred Congregation of the Council. Those articles state that psychic and hereditary differences between races exist, no doubt, but it doesn't follow from this that we can infer an immutable hierarchy. Unlike Nazi racist theories, there are, I'm quoting, ethnic groups with superior somatic, psychological and cultural qualities, and other groups with inferior qualities. Those theologians believe in a racial hierarchy, but within certain limits, being temporary, still evolving, and influenced by spiritual attitudes. And the second and last example is the pamphlet The Catholic Church and the Race Question, which was published by French theologian Yves Congar in 1953. This work is even more revealing in supporting an interracialist view on the ground of racialist differentialism. The essay was commissioned by UNESCO under the series The Race Question and Modern Thought, after the two famous statements of race of 1950-51 undoing scientific racism. Anyway, Congar proposes again the key racist idea of long established, not innate, the difference is subtle but pivotal, racial dissimilarities in mental attitudes, and reaffirms mainstream Catholic pattern by arguing that racism, point one, racism is an evil anti-Christian pseudo-religion which was derived from Enlightenment and secularization. Point two, Christianity acknowledges the diversity of races and peoples as a fact presumed to be one of the findings of science. Better still, I'm quoting, Christianity attaches to the existence of different peoples and contingently of different races, not merely a human and earthly value, but a Christian and providentially intended value. Point 3. Discrimination in colonies, in South Africa, in the United States, may be acceptable on the ground of a situation deriving from a historical fact, but never on the ground of purely racial differences. Point 4, and here Congar mentions the pastoral letter issued by the Catholic bishops of South Africa in 1952, the anti-black prejudice of white people is not only the only reason for racism. The problem is far more complex than that. Congar says, its complexity arises out of the fact that the great majority of non-Europeans, and particularly the Africans, have not yet reached a stage of development which would justify their integration into a homogeneous society with a European. Point 5. The Church is not racist. Indeed, she is the antithesis of racism. However, the Church recognizes that in the temporal sphere, the coexistence of different human groups within a single society does present difficult problems, not because of any radical inequality per se between the races which such groups represent, but because the groups as constituted are at different cultural and political, and hence at different human levels. So according to Congar, who mentioned American interracialism as a model, it is obvious that an excessive difference in levels of human evolution would prevent a too fast assimilation. This applies to South Africans, Black South Africans, as well as to African Americans. And to sum up, inequalities in development do not mean essential inequalities. Church is unity, but within that unity there is an organized diversity, and to that diversity, which includes the diversity of races, a well-understood diversity of races, a positive and sacred meaning is granted. So in conclusion, I hope I have shown some limits and contradictions of the emergence of Catholic anti-racism. I think this is a relevant matter in order to better understand the present situation too, and some original weaknesses of anti-racist mobilization. Let me mention two last aspects. Interracialists largely share the belief that racism was not only unfair, but also harmful for the future of the Church, because it fostered the communist menace and hindered Christianization. Working against anti-Black discrimination and recognizing the just demands of the Negro race sounded urgent so that African Americans did not fall prey to communism. Will the Negroes become communists? Father Lafarge had wondered with some concern in 1932. So there's something instrumental in supporting racial integration. Italian post-World War II missionary magazines suggest that the need to support the aspiration of peoples of color before the communists do. Anti-racism is not an independent variable. In a way, finally, Catholics were self-absolving in blaming Protestants for the theology of separate races. Lafarge himself wrote to French philosopher Jacques Maritain that racism was a product of Puritan deviation from the Christian true faith. This helps to understand why New Catholic anti-racism could gain momentum only after the Vatican II renewal. Thank you very much for your attention, and please contact me for any questions.